playing with this group.
Hey, vinyl community, Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and there's a thread going around that I want to participate in, and it's called The Greatest All-Time American Bands, and I'm going to do that for you. We opened with Opie Taylor, and that was to symbolize the downfall of Western civilization, the downfall of the American culture. Opie had been learning piano, learning compositions of the great European composers, learning the hymns, like How Firm a Foundation, so he would one day be able to play in his own church. And then rock and roll hit him. We find him in a barn playing rock and roll, joining a garage band, a barn band, I guess you would call it. And, you know, when we lose Opie, it all was lost, I say. So I'm going to give you the 10 best bands. I'm going to do it in two parts. I'm going to do 10 through 6 first for you. And not a single rock and roll artist in there. You know, we're kind of self-absorbed, self-centered as boomers. We were such a large segment of the population as we grew up, and there was so much disposable income, even for the poorest of us as we grew up. And we have it in our heads that everything begins and ends with rock and roll. And the millenniums are no different. They cannot claim any superiority in that regard. Neither can any of the alphabet soup of gens do so. But believe me, when you're talking about the greatest bands of all time from here in the United States, the rock and roll is far back in the list. So here we go, and I'll start with number 10, the Benny Goodman Orchestra. Okay, in the early 1930s, Benny Goodman, as son of Jewish immigrants living in Chicago, emerged. He was a clarinet player, and he put together one of the greatest bands of all time. Now, in a time frame when black and white musicians were not accepted to be able to play together, Benny broke the color barrier, and he really played a very important part. One of the first things he did was Fletcher Henderson was hired to come up with arrangements for his orchestra, and that really helped a whole lot. This was swing music, and boy, was it popular. And he was the biggest name in the business in the 1930s. He had a radio show on NBC Nationwide, and that gave him a lot of exposure. But it was when he really started swinging and not so reliant on the more bland pop sounds and much more toward the exciting swing music that his popularity. Now, this is as the 1930s progressed. He started taking some chances. He started incorporating some African American musicians into his band, which very much went against the grain of societal norms in the 1930s. And so Lionel Hampton starts appearing, Teddy Wilson, and Charlie Christian all played a part in Benny Goodman recorded and performed not only with the big orchestra but also with trios and quartets, and that's when this would often come into play. Even as his popularity and swing began to die out, he continued to perform. He was he didn't, as a lot of the swing musicians did, he did not reject bebop as it came up. He had listened to it with open ears and appreciated some, and had arrangements made for his orchestra to perform some of that bebop. He also had a strong interest in classical music, and he did the same thing with incorporating classical music into his music. Number 9, the Newgrass Revival. This is their one of their later albums, On the Boulevard, the second lineup. Now, Newgrass Revival was an extremely important band and one of the greatest bands in American history, led by Sam Bush, and originally Ebo Walker and Courtney Johnson and Curtis Birch were the original lineup. They had started off as 4/5 of the Bluegrass Alliance under Lonnie Pierce, who was a fiddler. They broke away. They were going to fire Lonnie, but Lonnie informed them that he owned the rights to the name Bluegrass Alliance, and he actually pulled a gun on them and told them they weren't going to leave. So chaos ensued. Eventually, nobody got shot, and they left the band and did not take the name with them. Lonnie would reform the band with new members, and they became the Newgrass Revival. They helped revolutionize bluegrass music. They did things that other people weren't doing. They recorded songs that didn't come from the normal sources. Contemporary songs from contemporary songwriters like Bob Dylan and Leon Russell and things like that. They engaged in jams, instrumental jams, rather than limiting their songs to the standard 3-minute, verse, chorus, with solos in between. Model for progressive bluegrass and for jam grass or jam bands in general. The Newgrass Revival. Now, gradually, members left. 74, they added John Cowan, who would go on from that point. They started around 71 or 72. They started at that point, and Cowan would be in the band for the rest of the time. As I said, a few years after they added John Cowan, Birch and Johnson left after a grueling series of dates with Leon Russell touring. And Bella Fleck and Pat Flynn became the banjo and guitar, respectively, players in the band. So in 84 or so, that new lineup took place. And they continued on until the late 1980s when Sam dispersed the band, broke up the band. They had signed with EMI and had put out a couple of records with EMI, and they kept trying to push them to, as a major label will do, to make a lot of compromises. And they decided that the compromises they were being asked to make in order to try to be more commercially mainstream were too much for them to swallow, so they disbanded. Now, if you want to hear the influence of Newgrass Revival, you need go no further than to put on a Billy Strings record. The hottest thing in acoustic music these days is Billy Strings. And you play a Billy Strings album or go to a Billy Strings concert, and you are going to hear a lot of Newgrass Revival influence. Now that brings us to number 8. And number 8 on our list of America's greatest bands all time is Chick Webb Orchestra. The Chick Webb Orchestra. And for many years, it featured Ella, a very young Ella Fitzgerald. Uh, Now, Chick Webb was an unbelievable drummer and band leader. And his band was based out of the Savoy in Harlem. The Savoy was the swinginest club you could ever imagine, and it was a place where lots of people of all different ethnicities came together to dance and enjoy each other's company, which was very contradictory uh, to the societal norms of that time, and probably what eventually got the Savoy shut down by the authorities. They didn't like that idea of the racist mixing. Uh, but Chick Webb was a very short, hunched over man, either with a birth defect or a spinal injury as a child, forced him. His growth was stunted, and he was stooped over somewhat as a hunchback, and was always in extreme pain. But he was a drummer. They put pillows all around him, prop him up, prop him up high in there, and he could play the drums just like nobody's business. He arrived in New York. I think he's from Baltimore originally. Arrived in New York in 26. By 31, he had his own orchestra, and the Savoy was his home. And what part of what makes him his band one of the greatest bands of all time is that they had battles of the bands. Let's fight it out. Let's see who's got the best band in America. And he went head to head with all the greats: Count Basie, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and fought it out with them at the Savoy. They had judges, and they would argue. The arguments would continue for as long as people that were there can remember what happened. It's believed that his band beat Benny Goodman's band. Benny Goodman said they beat us. Okay. From Kansas City, Count Basie came in with a sound different from what they were used to, and the judges deemed Chick Webb's band number one. And the only of those battles of the bands that he supposedly lost was against Duke Ellington, and by one judge's vote. And you can imagine how exciting that all those competitions might have been, and how hard it would be to declare one a winner. He took a plain looking girl that he didn't at first dismissed, and they said, no, you got to listen to her sing. And he listened to her sing, and he fell in love immediately with her voice and gave her a spot in his orchestra. That would be Ella Fitzgerald. And so we owe a great debt. Now, by, I believe it was 38 or 39, at less than 34 years old, Chick Webb died. I think it was kidney failure. And he passed away. And Ella took the band. She was still pretty young too, but the band stayed together and became the Ella Fitzgerald Band for several years before she went off in a different direction. Number 7 in our greatest bands of all time, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Okay, the Big Beat's the name of this album, and boy, does that describe it. What a great band. Uh, Art Blakey and Horace Silver formed the Jazz Messengers. There were some early bands before this, but when they really kind of set the time for the actual Jazz Messengers to begin at 1954. And just an unbelievable band led by Art Blakey. Now, Horace Silver stayed with them as a co-founder for a while, and then he left and went out on his own. But Art Blakey, from 1954 to his death in 1990, he ran that band, and that was one of the greatest bands of all time. And one of the things that makes the Art Blakey band, out, besides that big sound that I love, I mean, if you don't know anything about jazz and you go stick on an Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers record, man, if that doesn't make you a jazz fan, I don't know what will. But one of the things that makes it such a great band, besides that big sound, is that Art Blakey was such a smart band leader. He constantly brought in young talent, and not just brought them in and had them play, here you play this, but brought them in and had the various musicians do arrangements, write material, and create their own solos and so on and so forth, so that he was molding so many young musicians to become the great musicians they would become in the years beyond that. That alone makes the Jazz Messengers one of the greatest bands in American history. Early on, Kenny Dorman and Lou Donaldson were in the Jazz Messengers along with Horace Silver. But I mean, I've got a list here. I'm just going to name about 5 or 6, and this is just by no means an inclusive list. This is just scratching the surface. But people that played in the Jazz Messengers: Lee Morgan, Wayne Shorter, Freddie Hubbard, Hank Mobley, Keith Jarrett, Wynton and Bradford Marsalis. Number 6, the last in this edition, part 1 of America's all-time greatest bands. And I have the Memphis Jug Band. The Memphis Jug Band. Oh, what can you say about this band? They were amazing. Will Shade was the one central figure in the Memphis Jug Band, and there was a revolving cast of musicians, or maybe we should say characters, that made up the Memphis Jug Band, depending on the day of the week, depending on the type of venue they were going to do, just depending on what sound they wanted to get that day. But the Memphis Jug Band recorded from 27 to 34, about 80 tunes, 80 78s during that time, and Then again, there was a revival in the 1950s as the folk boom was taking flight of people coming in to Memphis and doing field recordings of the Memphis Jug Band. And you never knew what you were going to get. Literally, any time during any of that period, they back in the 20s and 30s, they played political rallies. They played they busked in the park. They played parties. They played rent parties. They played any and everywhere. They played for black audiences. They played for white audiences. They played all kinds of instruments. The kazoo was a prominent instrument. Obviously, the jug to provide that bass. They played a country blues, jazz, pop. They played Appalachian fiddle music, whatever you might want to hear, whatever a crowd may be there gathered to hear. They had fiddles, they had guitars, they had just a wide variety of instrumentation that was included in that band. So it varied. That's what's so cool. It just varied. One day they're here busking at the park. The next day they're playing a big hotel, a white hotel. And just it just varied so much. You may know them best from the Grateful Dead did 2 of their songs. And Stealin' Stealin', I think, was maybe one of the first singles the Grateful Dead ever released. And On the Road Again.
Wouldn't a black woman tell you the reason why? Black women even do things on the sly.
No.
You look for your supper to be good and hot. She never put a neck bone in the pot. She's on the road again. Lord, a nasty born Eastman on the road. She's on the road again. Lord, a nasty born Eastman on the road again. I went to my...
So there you go. The Memphis Jug Band, one of the greatest American bands of all time. So influential on so many different levels, from the folk to rock music to blues. They are one of the key bands that make American music great. So there's 10 through 6, part 1. And I'll be back, I don't know when, but I'll do a part 2. I know which bands I'm going to use, but I'll have to find time to make the video. Meanwhile, folks, I'd love to hear your comments down below. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. Please. I want to hear your opinions. Or tell me I'm right if you think I'm right. That'll work too. But I remind everybody, come on and let's be kind to our neighbors.